Dear colleagues, for those who are joining and perhaps those who are recording, we'll try to start within 5 minutes, or maybe perhaps we can allow 5 minutes for others to join. Okay. So I think we're going to start, colleagues. I'll present screen, and then I'll present for the next 1 hour. And then of course we'll wrap it up. Maybe every 5-10 minutes I'll be pausing just to allow others in the call. So maybe let me just go to presenter mode and share the slides. Okay. So I hope you'll be able to see my screen. I'll just wrap up quickly what we looked at yesterday, and I'll not repeat the same things. But basically, we're continuing on the second part of our brief lecture on mastering the art of scientific writing. And of course, my name is Joseph Piri. I'm a researcher, an academic editor, a consultant, and a lecturer. So maybe I'll just quickly speak about the purpose of the webinar, look at what we looked at yesterday, and then we'll proceed to today's lecture. So like we discussed yesterday, the purpose of this webinar is just basically to enhance capacity, which ensure that we improve on the quality of our academic writing for the purposes of research, perhaps getting our qualifications, and perhaps even in our professional work, and also to foster collaboration and create a network or a cohort of think tanks or a researcher. So we're going to enhance the aspect of data-driven decision making, and this will start by us acquiring the skills which are rightful and relevant for the industry, and that is why we thought of organizing this webinar. So I think I did speak about myself yesterday, so I'll skip that. So I think yesterday, for those who were there, we looked at the purpose, motivations of, and of course the importance of research. We did discuss the types of research outputs, and of course today we'll prioritize the aspect of doing an academic article, and of course more was discussed yesterday. And then of course we looked at identifying research gaps and formulating a topic, and I think we looked at two cases yesterday on environment and energy, as well as macroeconomic indicators. And then we looked at the role of literature in research, and then of course we concluded by looking at inductive vis-a-vis deductive report approach, and of course we looked at a video on the role of AI in doing research, and maybe if time will allow we'll discuss on that. Uh, Today we'll look at the methodological aspect, which will also include the conceptual framework, and then we'll look at findings, how to present presentations, and perhaps interpreting results. And then we'll look at the main aspect of today's research, which is the IMRAD writing style, the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And then we'll look at referencing styles, and in terms of style, strategies, and how you can use software to enhance your referencing efficiency. And then of course we'll conclude by looking at potential publication platforms and opportunities that might present themselves. So I hope you're able to get me, so perhaps I can go into the content for today. Just a moment, just to make sure that we continue on where we ended, right? Um, okay, I think we looked at this yesterday. We watched this video and we'll talk a bit about it, and I shared the link, and I'll be glad to do so today as well. So this is basically what I showed that we're going to look at today. So maybe we can start by looking at the slides that we are covering today, which is basically building a methodology for your research, right? Maybe I can open it up. If anyone is on the call, you can unmute yourself and comment. So what comes to your mind when you hear the word methodology, and why is it important in the field of research? Any thought? Anybody wants to comment? Tavo, Fiona, Mwila, do you want to comment on your thought on what comes to your mind when you hear methodology and its importance and how you could apply it? Just one or two quick comments and then we proceed.
All right, thank you. Just to briefly add on the topic of methodology, I'd like to mention, in my own understanding, which might vary from what everyone else might be thinking. Methodology would primarily revolve around how you intend on executing a particular assignment, in this case, executing a research. So your methodology would hinge or would be speaking to how you intend on performing that particular research practically. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically, if you are in a war and maybe you are having a war with a neighboring country, probably a methodology would be perhaps a strategy how you go about winning that battle, right? Now, of course, in the context of research, when we speak about methodology, it's an aspect about validating how we came up with the findings or the results we're trying to recommend or add to the body of knowledge. It's a very important component because the idea in academic writing is you cannot just present findings without showing how they were done. And of course, there are certain guidelines that might come up when it comes to a very good methodology, which we'll look at in the next few slides. For example, it should be something that can be replicable by other studies. So, on a nutshell, the methodology, like you could see on the slide, is a crucial component because it enhances the credibility and clarity of any research. And this is very important, especially even when it comes to governance, because now we're trying to ensure that we have societies or communities where decisions are guided by data. However, data alone is not sufficient in order to guide the decision. So that data can be transformed and then interpreted and analyzed, and based on the findings, and then decision can be recommended and encouraged. And that speaks to the how a methodology can enhance and contribute to decision making. So, four key points here that we can see when it comes to a methodology, right? It should be something that can be where something can replicate it, so that if you've done a research on Zambia, maybe you're looking at how can we increase. The Zambian government has always been aiming to produce 3 million metric tons of maize in the next of maize and copper. So if they're able to produce that, and then someone else learns to say how can also Zimbabwe do the same, they should be able to emulate how Zambia did it. So it's the same when it comes to research. If you're able to model and find out to say if our exchange rate increases, our copper export are able to decrease or increase, someone should be able to understand how you came up to that conclusion and should be able to do something similar using similar data in their area of interest. So, four key areas here. The key steps in building a methodology is, of course, you need to have a compelling argument. So that argument must really be appealing to the readers, and it also must make sense in terms of how you went about into crafting your argument into a research. And then, of course, when you are looking at a methodology, you need to understand that there's a difference between qualitative and quantitative research. Yesterday we looked at inductive and deductive approach, right? If you remember, in inductive approach, we looked at a general idea, the observations of patterns, and then in deductive approach, we looked at creating a hypothesis and then testing against that hypothesis. So more often than not, deductive approach is quantitative, and then of course inductive is qualitative in nature. So you have to know that both approaches can be applied when it comes to executing a methodology, and of course you also need to present your findings effectively in a way that can be appreciated. Just a moment, let me allow others in. Yeah, so that's basically one of the some key areas that might come into mind when you are working out a methodology. But like Tawa said, a methodology is a strategy that you need to show. To say, if for example you've done a study and then you found out to say bananas are very good for someone to grow faster as compared to not having them, you need to show how you came up to that conclusion. One way that people would apply that concept is maybe having RCTs, where you put people in a control group, give them bananas and a different set of people, and don't give them bananas, and then you compare. In that way, it's very easier to link the findings against a methodology that you've come across. So just as I look at the key approaches, sorry colleagues, my call is being distracted from time to time because I'm allowing the guys that joined in late. Apologies for that. Okay, so there are some key steps that one has to consider when crafting a compelling argument, right? The first step, which we did look at yesterday, is you need to define your research objectives and questions clearly. If you remember yesterday, we looked at the example of the El Nino phenomenon, where we are arguing that the environment is being worsened by activities like agriculture, energy, and industrialization. So already we had an issue of interest that we wanted to assess. So when you're having a methodology, you need to have a working concept, a working idea of which you define the objectives clearly, and they must be easy and much more easier to work with. Why is this important? Because when you're working out the methodology, the findings of the results must be linked to the methodology, the objectives, and it should be easier to recommend policies based on the objectives, the methodology, and the findings of the paper. So you have to be clear from the onset that the objectives must be clear and easier to understand, and of course easier to execute. And then you have to decide what approach you're going to use. Are you going the qualitative route where you're just looking at figures, where you're just looking at narrative data, or are you going the quantitative route where you're going to look at numbers that you're going to punch in and then you look at the behaviors across those numbers? Or are you looking at a combination of both, which is mixed methods? And then of course the third point, which is very key, is you need to justify your research design and selection of methods. And remember, the third step is guided by the first step, where your methodology and your objectives must be clear. And then as you develop a methodology, you need to ensure that you outline your data collection techniques. Are you collecting survey data? Is it interviews? Is it experiment? Or is it secondary data that you're going to model with regression analysis? Because remember, the questions that you ask are going to have a bearing on the data that you're going to collect. So for example, if you want to find out to say, do people that get the COVID vaccine, are their chances of contracting COVID less likely as compared to those without the vaccine? You already need to know the types of questions you ask. Maybe you might ask someone, were you vaccinated or not? And then you ask those who were not. So for those who are vaccinated, and then you want to find out whether they are unlikely to get COVID or not, of course you need to go for those who did a PCR or an antigen test. And then of course you might have a group of people that never did a test. And then over time you observe them, and then you ask yourself to say, what aspect could affect someone contracting COVID? Is it nutrition? Is it exercise? Is it diet? And all those aspects. Is it stress? And then you factor in all those figures and then compare against whether someone was tested for COVID or not, and whether someone was vaccinated or not, and then you go about asking your questions. So that aspect can only be guided if your objectives are clear from the onset. And then of course you need to describe your data analysis techniques. Are you going the statistical tests? Are you doing thematic analysis? Are you doing randomized control trials? Are you doing survival analysis? That has to come from the objectives, that has to come from the type of data you're collecting, your research design, and of course your data collection techniques. And then of course in many studies, for example in health studies or maybe at graduate level studies, you need to address the issue of ethical considerations for transparency and integrity. If you're interviewing people, you need to be clear with them why you're interviewing them. You need to be clear with them whether their data is anonymous. You need to be clear whether permission ought to be sought. Are you dealing with sensitive data? Is it people's health results? Are you dealing with animals? Does your research is your research done on an individual level, or are you representing an institution? All that has to be clear, and most importantly, what is the purpose of that research? So that has to be clear when it comes to the issues of ethical consideration. So maybe before I move on, let me just allow some people in. Okay, so maybe we can go back to the next point on crafting a compelling argument. Remember on the previous slide we looked at these 6 key points, right? Defining research objectives and question, choosing the type of data, is it qualitative, quantitative, or mixed, justifying your research design for selection, and then of course determining the type of data you're collecting. Is it survey data, is it interviews, is it experiment, or is it empirical data that you're analyzing from a secondary source? And then of course you need to determine the analytical techniques. Are you going the statistical analysis, regression, ANOVA, chi-square? Are you going the thematic analysis route, or are you doing cluster analysis, or are you doing randomized control trials? All those are very much important. And then of course there's the aspect of addressing ethical considerations for transparency and integrity. Remember at the beginning we said that a research that is done has to be open. It has to be something that can be replicated by other researchers, and that's why the aspect of transparency is key. And the other aspect why a methodology is important is whatever research you do has to be authentic and has to be validated by experts in the field. And that's why these aspects and these steps are very much essential. So you don't just pick a newspaper article and say the causes of cholera in Zambia last year were high and then you start a research. So you have to build a case and then you have to compare and have to have an estimation technique, some analytical techniques which can lead to results that are replicatable, results that can be appreciated, and of course results that can be applied to enhance decision making. So, when it comes to crafting a compelling argument, there are some strong issues that you have to consider in terms of how a strong methodology should come out and what we could consider when it comes to instituting a very good methodology. The first one is similar to what we looked at earlier on. It has to align with your research questions. The challenge that I've seen with many of us researchers, especially those who are quantitative in nature, you find that your objectives do not align with your analysis. So sometimes you might have very good analysis, but if they do not align with your research questions or your objectives, and then the research becomes irrelevant. So you have to be careful about linking these aspects. Second one, a strong methodology has to justify the selection of methods. So is it something that has been done and you're replicating it, or is there a relationship between the method you're doing, the objectives, or is the estimation technique you're applying the correct one for the data that you are using? These are issues that you have to be clear and you have to clarify even as you work out your methodology. The third point is it ensures reliability, validity, and replicability. Very important. First, your results must be reliable. So if you have a model, when you test it, it must not have a lot of faults. If the model or the analysis you've done has got a lot of faults, then your results are unreliable and they cannot be used to make inferences. So very important. Secondly, the results should be valid enough and they should be acceptable in terms of the rules of scientific integrity and all. Then of course the most important point is if you've worked out a methodology, someone else should be able to appreciate the methodology and replicate it in a similar studies. So there are two approaches that you can do this. One can replicate a study that has been done from one country and then you do it in another, or a study that has been done at country level and then you do it at regional level. Or you might be the first one who's done that research. I remember like yesterday I did share a study on the impact of macroeconomic indicators and regime change on debt stress in Zambia. When I look at the model that I developed, especially the aspect of regime change and how it influences our debt stress levels, no one has done that globally. So the idea is when you develop a model, someone should be able to follow through your data, analyze and do something similar in a related country that is facing the same problem. So that is why the issue of replicability is very important. The issue of novelty is very important. If you're going to do something that is very complicated where no one can emulate it, then maybe you might need to readjust your strategy for the benefit of others that follow after you. And then of course a good methodology discusses limitations and mitigates the biases. So more often in research, especially when it comes to quantitative, you might find that the model that you have might have limitations. So you have to find a way to addressing those limitations. The standard rule in research is there is no model that is 100% reliable. But at least at the barest minimum, 95, 98, you can play around with the model as the most optimal model. So the issue is when you run a model, you test it, it might have some challenges or some limitations. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to mitigate the limitations that exist. If you're in a situation where you cannot mitigate, but some of the steps are correct, you have to acknowledge the limitations of your research to say this research does not go as far as this area in terms of time period or in terms of methodological rigor. So this is something that we shouldn't feel shy about. If our research has got some limitations, we can actually acknowledge them in the write-up. So if you're doing a thesis, for example, and you found that maybe you would have done maybe 30 years of data for time series and then you went for 27, as long as you acknowledge that as a limitation and then you account for it, it actually saves you from a lot of scrutiny. So just be careful to acknowledge limitations, but most importantly, mitigate any limitations if and when the capacity provides for that. And then of course the research, in terms of the strong methodology, it strengthens the credibility and impact. So just before I pause for questions, let me just allow the others who are on the call in the waiting room, just a moment. Okay, So, is there any question from anyone so far on what we've covered? I think we have enough time, so I'll be able to take one or two questions as we go. Any question from anyone so far? I hope I'm not too fast though, right? Yes, you can go ahead.
I think Jeff has a question.
Yes, Jeff, you can go ahead.
All right, thank you, Doc. So mine is just a quality that I want to find out when it comes to limitation when you're doing maybe a time series research. So if at all you're doing something, let's say for 30 years, but you find that data is limited, maybe it's only up to 20 years, and how do you counter for that 10 years limitation in data? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there are two possibilities. One, you can still go ahead with it as long as you can prove that others who've gone before you have managed to model data with a similar time period. And you just have to make sure that those others who went before you were able to publish in credible journals. And then it's very easy for another doctor to, for another reviewer to accept that. Secondly, another approach you can take when it comes to time series data is you can actually interpolate some data sets. So you can say that maybe if you're trying to analyze, let's say from 1990, and then the data is only available up to 2015. So you can actually linear or maybe polynomial can interpolate it up to the current period, and then you acknowledge that as a limitation. So, or you can actually backdate it. So you just have to be careful that if you transpose any data set, you just explain that that was done so that people can understand that part of the data there was not in its original form. So that's one way you can consider it. But if you're looking at a 30-year time period for time series, I think that's just a guiding rule, but it's not rubber stamped. So you find that even for 30 years, you can still go up, pull through with 25 years. And that's why the issue of validity is key. You test for your model, is it normally distributed? Were there structure breaks? And then as you proceed, you check if there was no threats of serial correlation, heteroscedasticity, and the model was stable, then you could still go ahead with it and succeed. And then you just cite others who've come before you to avoid a potential attack to that effect. So there's a way you can go about it in terms of first acknowledging it. Secondly, if there's an option to transpose or interpolate, you can go that route. But the most important thing is you have to acknowledge that as a limitation so that it's clear from the onset. Yeah. I hope I answered your question. Okay, thank you, Jeff. So maybe I can proceed now to the slides. So we just looked at crafting a compelling argument. This is very important in terms of an argument being compelling in nature because how you write, what you write, how you justify it has an impact on whether your work is accepted or not. And later on, you're going to notice that it's not always that our research gets accepted. So that's why these strategies are very much essential for our works, whether at graduate level, at undergraduate level, or perhaps in our works. And then, of course, when it comes to research, there's this debate about quantitative, qualitative. So I'll just cover them quickly and then we can move to the next aspect, right? So if you remember yesterday, we looked at deductive approach, inductive approach. And I did mention at the beginning that deductive approach is qualitative in nature. Otherwise, inductive is quantitative in nature. So how then would you differentiate the two? And is there a way you can combine the two? So firstly, quantitative in nature, there's one guiding principle. It focuses on numerical data and statistical analysis. So you find that for those who use software, maybe you're using Stata, you're using SPSS, you'll notice that these are called numeric variables and you're able to play around with them because they have numbers. Some of the softwares will not be able to accept non-numeric numbers unless you model it as a string variable. So most often than not, quantitative data focuses on numerical data and statistical analysis. And there's a lot of analysis you can do. It can be a chi-square, it can be a t-test, it can be ANOVA, it can be regression analysis, which can be cross-sectional, time series, panel, and now there are new models like difference in indifference. And then there's also aspect of cluster analysis, which can be applied in terms of quantitative or qualitative in nature. So there's a lot that you can do with this type of data set. Second point, very important, ideal for hypothesis testing and generalization. So if you compare the difference between the two, you can only test hypothesis against quantitative data. And then of course common methods could be survey, experiment, and secondary data. But we'll not build into this into today's lecture, but we'll cover it in a subsequent lecture. And then of course in terms of qualitative research, it explores behaviors. I'm sure you noticed from what we did yesterday where you observe pattern, it observes perceptions, and it observes experiments. And then best for in-depth understanding and exploratory studies. And then of course it's a common method. These are interviews, focus groups, or case studies. Now, I just wanted to say something about these two before we move to a combination of both. More often than not, it could be easier to model some data which is quantitative and come out with results. But I would also mention that qualitative approach is equally important in the sense that you need to have a specific skill or a specific writing style to play around with qualitative data. So it's not just getting text and putting it together. There has to be a way that you write in order for it to be appealing. And that is why we looked at, for example, inductive approach. So if you just plug in words here and there, it might not work or give out a good output. So as much as some of us might be quantitative in nature, it's safe to say that qualitative is not as easy as others might perceive. So when you use each of the approaches, use quantitative data for measurable trends. This is something that you can look at numbers, correlations, regressions, and the list is endless. Use qualitative data for detailed insights. So you can have appreciation when it comes to qualitative data, right? Because you speak more to the truth, you speak more to the reality on the ground, much more than numbers. However, many of us, when we do research, we actually combine them, and that has come out to be quite effective, which is a mixed methods approach, which combines both qualitative and contextual data. So let me just allow our colleagues on the call. Just a moment, guys. My apologies that I have to allow people in, but at the same time they also need to benefit, so you bear with me on that one. Okay, so that's basically a bit of a thought about quantitative and qualitative data. So even as we looked at this, let's think about developing a conceptual framework. So now I'm going to pause for a moment, and then I'm going to share a 4-minute video about developing a conceptual framework, and then we'll build on into the IMRAD writing styles. So just a moment so that I can share something. Okay. Okay.
Do you have to write up a conceptual framework for your thesis? Then you should definitely keep watching. A conceptual framework illustrates what you expect to find through your research. It defines the relevant variables for your study each other. In this video, we'll go through an example with 2 key variables: hours of study and exam score. Scriber, here to help you achieve your academic goals. You developed a conceptual framework based on your literature review. Speaking of which, we have a whole playlist on literature review. Check it out here. By looking at what other researchers have found or theorized, you can come up with ideas about the relationship between your variables. And based on what we've learned about these variables from our literature review, we think that studying more hours will cause a higher exam score. We want to test whether there is a cause and effect relationship between the amount of hours you study and the exam score you get. That means hours of study is our independent variable and exam score is our dependent variable. because we think that exam score depends on hours of study. A conceptual framework can be designed in many different ways. The form yours takes will depend on what kinds of relationship you expect to find. To visualize our expected cause and effect relationship, we will use the basic design components of boxes, arrows, and lines. We use the boxes for the variables and an arrow starting from the independent variable to indicate a causal relationship. Now that we have the basics laid down, let's move on to expanding the conceptual framework. As you develop your conceptual framework, you should also aim to identify other variables that might influence the relationship between your independent and dependent variables. Here are some common variables to be incorporated into the conceptual framework: mediator variables, moderator variables, and control variables. A moderator alters the effect that an independent variable has on a dependent variable. For example, the variable IQ moderates the effect that the number of study hours has on the exam score. In other words, the higher IQ, the fewer hours of study you must put in to do well on the exam. A mediating variable is a variable that links the independent and dependent variables, helping explain how or why the independent variable affects the dependent variable. For example, the hours of study impacts the variable number of practice problems completed, which in turn impacts the exam score. The more hours a student studies, the more practice problems they will complete. The more practice problems completed, the higher the student's exam score will be. By adding the mediating variable of number of practice problems completed, we help explain the cause and effect relationship between the two main variables. So while both moderators and mediators have an impact on the dependent variable, the key difference between them is a moderator is not affected by the independent variable. A mediator is affected by the independent variable. For example, the variable IQ is a moderator, not a mediator. Although IQ may impact the exam score, which is the dependent variable, the number of hours spent studying, which is the independent variable, does not affect IQ. This might be a hard pill to swallow, but no matter how many hours you study, your IQ will not increase. A control variable is a variable that is held constant to prevent it from influencing the outcome of a study. These are variables that aren't relevant to your research question. You're not interested in actually studying their effects, you just want to make sure they don't interfere with your results. For example, it's likely that if a student feels ill, they will get a lower score on the exam. Therefore, we'll add health as a control variable. Now you should know the basics you need to construct a conceptual framework. Click on this playlist to continue working on other parts of your research process. I'll see you in the next video.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that video. So let me go back to the slides, right? But maybe before we proceed, any question on what you just saw, or any comment perhaps? Okay, so let me proceed now to the next few slides. So we've looked at developing a conceptual framework, which was very key in terms of having a methodology that we work with, right? So now moving forward, before we move to the main style of writing, maybe one thing that you need to look at quickly is the presentation and interpretation of findings. So for qualitative research, most often than not, for quantitative story, we use tables, graphs, and statistical tests. And then of course we report key metrics, right? P-values, confidence intervals, effect sizes. Now on the p-values, even though this is not a quantitative class, I just want to comment that more often than not, others report coefficients that are significant at 1%, 5%, or 10%. They are all acceptable, but the majority would report at 5%. And of course, if you have only a few variables at 5%, then you can go ahead and report some that are significant at 10%. It's the same with confidence levels. Others report at 90, 95, or 99. So you find that a 5% p-value corresponds to 95% confidence in terms of the output, right? So more often than not, if you are running some analysis where you want to find out the cause and effect, it's always important to check whether the coefficients we are comparing are statistically significant or not. And that's why the issue of p-values comes in. And in that case, at 5%, we have to make sure that they have a corresponding probability that is less than 5%. And then, of course, when it comes to effect sizes, we're looking at the issues of magnitude. But the recommendation is that ensure that findings are reproducible and statistically valid, right? We've spoken about the issue of being valid. So if you share this data set that you use to analyze with someone and they replicate the same methodology that you've used, irregardless of the software, the output must be the same. If the output is contrary, then there might be questions on your analysis. Then for qualitative research, of course, we have to organize data using thematic analysis and coding. So in terms of thematic analysis, we have to be guided by a topic of interest, right? So I remember, for example, my grade 12 geography project was on privatization in Zambia. So if you are researching on privatization in Zambia as your thesis, every content that you speak to must be linked or related to privatization. If you're going to bring in issues of governance, bring in issues of corruption, and they're not related to the topic of at hand, then you've probably lost the direction, and that is why you need to be careful when it comes to qualitative analysis. And then, of course, you have to present insights with direct quotations for clarity. So always make sure that whatever you find is related to your objectives and related to the topic at hand. And always make sure that the statistics or data that you present in a qualitative research are aligned with what you're trying to find and answer your 3, 4, or 5 questions that your research proposes to find. And then, of course, most importantly, you have to link interpretations to research objectives and theories. I just want to make a note when it comes to theories, whether it's an article, maybe a thesis, and I think most of us would want to have many pages in our output. I think it's not necessary to have so many theories. Normally 3 is enough, maybe if you go overboard 4, but you cannot have 20 theories explaining the same objectives. It's very much possible, but if you have so many theories, you can stick to the most relevant and perhaps the most recent, and always have those that are backed by empirical studies. So just be careful with having so many theories being quoted in your study. It's not recommended. It's always good to have a reasonable number. And then, of course, when it comes to the presenting and interpreting or finding, you have to be careful that a well-structured methodology enhances research credibility. Choosing the right approach ensures clarity and rigor, and of course, effective presentation strengthens the study's impact. So, I'm sure you've noticed that we've spent more time on the methodology, much more than any other part, right? The reason is simple. Most of the research has to be backed by a strong methodology, which is then enhanced by good findings and strong impact. If you have a research where the methodology is not strong, that already disadvantages your work. So be careful with your research. I have marked some theses where someone will just say research design, I'm going to have a sample size of maybe 60, and the only thing you show in the methodology is the sample size calculator. So you have to be very detailed in your methodology, you have to be very rigor, and it has to be something that is impactful and you can benefit from others. One technique you can use in terms of methodology is you can actually emulate what others have done. So for example, you're doing a research on the impact of energy on CO2 emissions in Zambia. And this research has not been done in Zambia, and someone did a similar study in Kenya and someone did a similar study in Ethiopia. You can actually replicate that methodology, apply either similar data or similar data with similar attributes, and then do it for your focus area of study. So you just have to be careful when it comes to a methodology. So it has to be something that is relatable to someone who's doing research. So if I want to do a similar research, and I wanted to mention this, that this is the sole reason why we do a literature review survey. So when you're doing a literature review, just like the table I mentioned yesterday, you can actually learn from others in terms of their methodology. So imagine you've cited 50 articles that did a similar research to what you are doing, and none of them have done something similar to your methodology. Then maybe your literature survey was not as aggressive. So all those are pointers that you can apply in terms of having and presenting a strong interpretation of methodology and findings. So any questions so far? So we have 2 more components in today's lesson. We'll look at the IMRAD structure, and then we'll look at referencing, and then we'll open it up in terms of publication opportunities. So IMRAD is quite a new, a common way of writing. IMRAD stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. So it's the standard structure for most scientific papers. But now one would ask to say, why is it that on IMRAD, like you could see, there is no literature review? So you're going to see later on that you can actually plug in literature in the introduction, in the methods, and in the results. So other journals would require you to have a literature review section, but it's not always mandatory, especially now with modern ways of writing. So everything normally modernizes and changes. Just like football, some of us, when we used to watch Man U in its glory days, would have 4-4-2 formation, but now we have people playing 4-3-3, 4-2-3-1. So all those are issues that you have to move with when it comes to which one is the best strategy in terms of implementing. However, this does not say that if you do an article with a literature review section, then it's not acceptable. It is acceptable, but this is just a style that's common and that's widely used, and I thought I could share it. The same way that a software like R or Python is trending is the same way that this approach is trending in terms of the strategies that you could use to write your scientific articles, whether it's a book chapter, whether it's an article. However, when it comes to a thesis, most theses will still require you to have a literature review section. So this one will probably more encourage when you do a scientific article. So just to make clarity on that one. So maybe let me go deeper into what is involved in the introduction, methods, results, and the discussion. So in the introduction, like for an article, and at the end of this I'm going to share one of the articles that I applied the IMRAD writing style. So here, the first thing you could see is that it's establishing the research problems and objectives. So you have to make sure that all those aspects are covered in an introduction, and then you can look at the background of the research topic, which could include some statistics and maybe a problem you're trying to address, and of course the motivation at hand. And then you should have some research gap, maybe some also an area of novelty, and then you have some objectives, and then there's a bit of an overview of related studies. Then you can have a hypothesis, or you can have some research questions. It depends on the article you're targeting, or it depends on your writing style. So there is no rubber stamp rule that you should always have a hypothesis or always have a research question. It's basically up to you and up to the intended publisher that you intend to approach. And then of course, others put a preview of the paper, so you could actually put a summary on what the entire paper intends to focus on. And we're going to look at a typical paper as we look at these structures to see if we can apply or replicate something similar. And then I just wanted to mention that here in the introduction, if you're looking at a study, it's always good that you can also cite related studies speaking to what you're trying to study, and that in itself is part of literature review. And that is why most often than not, when you use the IMRAD writing style, you don't have a literature review section. But that does not mean you shouldn't have literature in your work. It is strongly recommended that you should have some citations. Then the methods, others will call it data and methods, others will call it methods. So what normally is contained in the method section, here it could explain the research and how it was conducted, like what Tabo earlier mentioned. So here you could include the study design, you could include the geographic location, and maybe some characteristics of the data, or maybe some background to what you're trying to study in terms of this section. So this can be a section called study design, it can be called data. And then you need to speak about tools, so which is the estimation techniques, the data collection strategies, the materials, and the data that's going to be used, as well as their sources. And then of course the last point, very important, which is the justification of the methodological choices. If you remember yesterday, I always said always do a literature survey. So now this is where you can come in to say, in this research I've applied ANOVA because Gordon, Tabo, and Jeff applied this in a similar study, and I feel like this is the right strategy. So you always have to make sure that you are able to cite related studies. So I just want to make mention here that if you're applying a statistical analysis or maybe an econometric analysis, don't limit your justification to only a textbook. So if, for example, you are doing an IMRAD model and then maybe you've cited Gujarati or maybe Woodrich, try to make sure you cite the person that created that methodology. Like in the case of IMRAD, is Pesaran, and then try to make sure you cite recent scientific studies that agreed to your methodology. That helps much more than just relying on a textbook. So just be careful with that one. because sometimes you might have a textbook that's outdated, maybe a textbook with 2005, and there's a lot of studies that have been done. So just be careful to always back whatever you are citing with the founders of that model, and then also to back it up with recent studies to speak to the justification of the methodology. And then after that, the next part is of course results. So now you'll notice one thing about the results in terms of the issue of the literature review. So here you present key findings with minimal interpretation, and I'll explain how. And then summarize data using tables, graphs, or statistics depending on your approach. And then avoid interpretation of an irrelevant data. So only report key findings and statistically significant results. So if you remember on the conceptual framework, that video that we saw, it was mentioned that only explain the results that are related to your objectives and nothing else. Now, one strategy that you can apply on the results here, which covers on why we don't use literature review, is if your findings agree or disagree with someone that you've quoted in your introduction section, you need to mention here to say my findings are in alignment with the findings of Jeff and maybe Gordon, but they're contrary to the finding that Tabo had in their studies. So that's actually a concept of literature review that you apply on the results section. And the same is done on the discussion, where you interpret findings in the context of existing research or earlier cited works in the same paper. So remember, whatever you're citing in the introduction, in the method, you're also citing it in the discussion if the findings are similar or contrary. And then of course interpretation of results in relation to the research questions, very important. Whatever results you respond to, methodology must be aligned with your research questions, objectives, or perhaps hypothesis. If anything is contrary to the research questions and objectives, don't address it. And remember, we said only discuss the statistically significant results. That's the best way to summarize your work and move on with your findings. And then of course the fourth point is comparison with existing literature. I did mention you can acknowledge whose studies are similar to your findings and whose studies are contrary to your studies, and this can be in any field and on any paper. Most important aspect also, you have to acknowledge the limitations and also speak to issues of future research. This is a very important aspect that you always have to move with when it comes to scientific writing. So always remember to cite your work, always relate your findings to everything that you've cited. Okay, so, and then of course, what are some of the strategies you can apply for a good paper using the IMRAD papers? Just a moment, let me let your colleagues in. Okay, so let me go back to the slides now. So what are some of the strategies that you could institute? The first point is clarity. Always keep sections distinct and logically ordered. Like the way I was explaining, right? There is a consistency in mentioning the related findings of the literature that you are referring to. The second point is consciousness, right? Avoid unnecessary information and stick to essential details, right? We've always mentioned stick to your objectives, stick to your findings, and stick to your discussion. Don't bring in irrelevant points just to fill up the numbers. No. Consistency. Ensure alignment between objectives, methods, and findings. Very important even as you are building a case in this study. And then evidence-based argumentation. Support claims with data and citations. So whatever you are saying, be it statistics, bringing a problem to the fore, there's an increment in cases of rape in Zambia, always cite the numbers as you are building a case. Don't just leave it as a normative statement. And then of course, relevance. Stay focused on the research problem and contribution to the body of knowledge. What are some of the strengths of the IMRAD writing formats? It provides a clear framework for structuring research papers. Each section serves a specific purpose and should be well defined. It applies effective strategies and enhances the quality of scientific writing. And most importantly, always ensure logical flow and alignment throughout the paper. So maybe before we move to the next section, let me try to show you one paper that I would have applied with IMRAD, right? Then you'll be able to see if what we did say is something that we can benefit. So let me try to go to Google Scholar. Just a moment. So I'll be biased. I'm going to speak about the paper that was published in the journal that I'm aligned to, because it's a journal that I'll be promoting today. So I hope you don't mind. Um, so I'm just trying to search for it using keywords like we learned yesterday, right? It was one of the papers that we did. So I just want to show you how I went about it. So let me just download it. So I did this paper with the help of my undergraduate students. So this is just to mention that even if you're doing your undergraduate paper studies, you can actually do a paper that can compete even at PhD level. So feel free to take up the challenge, my colleagues. So let me just download it. Okay, just a moment. Okay. So this was the paper on the impact of macroeconomic indicators and regime change on debt stress in Zambia. So I'll just speak about the motivation I had behind this paper. So I did notice that in Zambia, every time we change a president, there was always negotiating for debt, and then you find that there was debt forgiveness, but a few years later we go back to borrowing much more than the previous president. So if you give a background, which was in this study, you'll remember that when Chiloba came in, there was the structural adjustment reforms which came in, and there was a lot of debt forgiveness. Mwanawesa came in, there was the issue of the HIPIC, debt forgiveness. When PF came in, there was the issue of the Eurobond, debt forgiveness, and of course now we have the IMF deal, right, which has to be completed by the end of October. So it's the same trend that has occurred over and over. And you notice that when you come to one of the sections here, you notice that our external debt in 2010 was 4 billion, and then in 2015 it was 11 billion, and as at 2020 when this paper was analyzed, it was over 30 billion, right? Of course, half of it was the public guaranteed debt. So you find that there's always going back to borrowing, renegotiating, but our debt levels keep going up. And of course, there was the issue about the macroeconomic environment, our economy, our GDP, inflation, exchange rate. Did it have a bearing on our debt stress levels? So that was the thinking that I had behind this study. And then of course I did the literature survey that I showed you guys yesterday, and then came up with a model. I'll just show you the model quickly, which was basically debt is a function of GDP, growth, inflation, FDI, tax, lending rate, and then I had a dummy for each year that we had and the subsequent year that we had a new president in Zambia, and then I tried to model how it impacted our debt stress levels. It will be interesting to note that in the short run, every time we change our president, in that year our debt stress level was reduced by 3%, in the subsequent year by 10%, but as we move to the end of his president or her presidency, the debt stress levels of that president becomes worse than their predecessor. So these problems keeps on revolving, and we don't know where we'll go now going forward. So that was the thinking behind this research. Now, how was I applying the IMRAD writing style? You could see that of course we had the abstract, and then we had the introduction, the I, and then after the introduction, the second section was methods, right? So here was the methods, and then the next part of course is the results and discussion, and of course it had the conclusion. But this is just basically how I arranged this article, and you notice that much of the literature in terms of the results, the methodology was also cited in the beginning in the introductory chapter. So this does not mean you do not have a literature review. You do have, except that you do cite articles as you build on. And if you remember on the data and methods, I did mention that you can put a background about what you are studying in terms of the area of interest. So here there was just a section on Zambia's political and economic outlook attributed to debt, how much debt we had, and that background. So this is how I did apply the IMRAD writing style with regards to this specific paper that was done. And of course we'll speak more to the journal as we wrap up in the next 15 minutes or so. So that's basically how I did apply the IMRAD writing style in terms of the work that was being done. But maybe I can pause if there's a question or two before we go to the issue of referencing. Any questions, comments?
Doc, I've got a question on methodology.
Yes, go ahead.
Since you can either adopt a similar methodology that was done before elsewhere and see how you can replicate it, or you can create one of your own. So, especially when you create one of your own, how do you go about fact checking it to make sure that nothing was left out? Because considering that the whole process of building a model might not be as straightforward. Thanks.
So I think you apply the same content that we learned in the video I shared about the conceptual framework, right? So for example, if we're looking at, let's assume this paper was just on the impact of regime change on debt stress in Zambia. Then you need to ask yourself what other factors could influence a country borrowing debt or having more or less debt. So that already becomes a guiding principle. For example, in the video we watched about performance, students' grades, right? The issue was about long hours. But that was the objective, right? But one asked what other factors could affect performance. So if one is ill, probably you're not as productive as you could. Or if one has a high IQ, like you, Gordon, so you find that your performance might be more enhanced, right? So it's the same when you're developing a model. What guides is the method, is the objective. So maybe the 2-3 objectives would guide the main variables of interest. Then everything else that comes in as a control can be anything that could have a bearing on the dependent variable. But in terms of quantitative analysis, the most important thing is if the model is representative and the statistical techniques are valid, then you are good to go. So you find that with the model that I did, if I only put the dummy of regime change, you find that maybe the model only have an error squared of 10%. But if you put the other variables, you find that my error squared was up to 90%. So already that speaks to the fact that those variables of interest could have a bearing on the variable of objectivity. Then as long as you test for that, and then of course you do some diagnostic tests, you do a VIF, you check to say, are the variables interrelated, to make sure that there is no bias in the output. So this is very important. So as long as you are able to work and clarify that, then that could go ahead and work. And of course you could develop a theory that could then be generally accepted. For example, for those of you who do economics, we've done the Phillips curve about the inverse relationship between unemployment and economic unemployment and inflation, right? It's just someone who plugged in figures, created the theories in the late 80s, and now we've accepted it as a theory. So you can actually go as far as creating something that is new from scratch, and then over 20 years, 10 years it's adopted, and who knows, you can even get the Nobel laureate. So it doesn't really matter whether it's something new, as long as it's justifiable and is backed by an estimation technique that someone can replicate. So that's basically how it works. So for example, my thinking behind this topic and the other two that I've had, I've always argued that debt stress is a measure of economic development. And that's what I'm always having these studies. So if I can do maybe 3, 4, 5, 10, and they get cited for the next 100 years, who knows, that could come up as a theory in terms of factors that could enhance economic development. So it doesn't hurt to come up with something totally new, but at the same time it doesn't hurt to replicate what others have done in another location, as long as you can acknowledge. I think the most important rule when it comes to research ethics is acknowledge where others have ended. Yeah. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so let's move on to the next few slides. I think we've covered a bit on the IMRAD writing style. So I think this is just basically a general question in terms of what are some of the top publishers, journals where you can publish. I just selected a few, maybe based on my line of interest. So sometimes when you're targeting a journal, you might not know by basis of the journal, but I think if you can target a journal on the basis of a publisher, then you're probably safe. So for me, a rule of thumb, I did mention yesterday that Google Scholar is okay, but the problem with Google Scholar is it can combine quality and trash, so you might not know. So most of the top universities around the world, even here in Zambia, some of the top researchers, they make sure that whatever journal they publish in is indexed in Scopus or Web of Science, or in PubMed for those in the medical field. So for example, some of the publishers that personally I aim to target in my life of research is Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, Sege, Oxford University Press, American Chemical Society, MDPI, +1, and the list is ended, right? Even IMRAD. So for those of you who might not know, and this is information that is good for us to know, you'll find that if you're an undergraduate and you publish a journal in Taylor and Francis and in Sege, maybe 2 papers, you're as good as someone with a PhD. Except that most often than not, sometimes we are not sure on what's the best platform to get our work at. So always aim for the top journals, and it's very easy to stand out even at your level. So you find that in academic writing, sometimes we are ranked by virtue of an H index. So even if you're a bachelor's degree holder, as long as you're aggressive in the space, you get the same amount of respect as someone with a PhD, even if you might not have it. So this is just something to encourage you to say, if you can aim for these journals, publish 1 or 2 papers, you find yourself even getting a scholarship at Cambridge. So that's basically the criteria that works in order for people to enhance their credibility in terms of research, because we also have predatory journals where you submit an article at 9 hours, at 9:30 they accept it. You have to be careful with those journals. Normally you have to go through a review process, maybe 2 to 5 months, some even up to a year, in order to publish. So this is just a hint that I wanted to alert you to. And then of course, let's look at referencing, then I'll speak a bit about publication opportunities, and then we'll open up for questions, right? So referencing is very important because it acknowledges sources, it avoids plagiarism, it strengthens argument with credible evidence, it demonstrates existence, research, and engagement literature, and it helps readers locate original sources of your work, right? And then what helps in terms of referencing, right? You have to acknowledge the source and avoid plagiarism, strengthen arguments with credible evidence, demonstrate extensive research and engage literature, and of course you help our colleagues, right? So some of the common referencing styles, there's the APA, there's the MLA, there's the Chicago, there's the Harvard, and the list is endless. There are thousands of referencing styles, right? So in terms of referencing, what could help in terms of having an effective referencing style? Of course, you have to keep track of sources from start. You can use referencing management tools, e.g. Zotero, Mendeley. You can follow the required style and then guide and the consistency in that space, and of course cite primary sources where possible, and also double check citations for accuracy. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you a quick video on Zotero referencing style before we wrap it, but I'll just cover the last part in view of time, and then we'll be able to move with that. So in terms of I'll just speak about opportunities quickly, and then we'll go back to the referencing, right? Just a moment, let me go back to the previous slides. So I'll just share something quickly, then I'll play a 6 minutes video, and then we'll conclude. So one of the journals that you can aim to target is the +1 journal, the same one where this paper was published. So feel free to reach out. I'm an editor in this journal. It's a very credible journal. It's in Web of Science, it's in Scopus, and it's one of the top 10% of journals. And then besides that, I also wanted to share an opportunity which will be posted online. I'm currently having an engagement with Taylor and Francis where we're calling for contribution on a book, Development Economics, Global Perspective, and Contemporary Challenges. So feel free to reach out. Maybe in the next week or two, this will be public domain. If you want to contribute a chapter or everything, feel free to reach out and I'll share that information. But I just want to mention that this is a global advert, so you compete with people around the world, but please don't dare to compete. So this is just 16 chapters to be a good 300-page document, which we hope to be ready by next year. And we hope to see it applied and used in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin, and Asian Pacific, because the examples and the approaches we want to apply in this book are new. So in view of time now, let me try to play a quick video on referencing with Zotero, and then we wrap it up because the webinar is supposed to end at 4. So forgive me for rushing it. So just a moment. And then of course that is my email, just for you to check, jozefpiri@gmail.com. Yeah, you'll be able to follow me on LinkedIn. And then if you want more of this content, it will probably premium, but at least this one was free and I was glad to share that. So let me just share a quick video on referencing with Zotero, and then we can conclude with that. So just a moment. Okay. So I'll stop sharing. just a moment. Okay, just a moment. Okay.
One of the amazing features of Zotero.
Okay, so let me just come back and then I stop share and then I share the video for our benefit as we wrap up. So there you go.
Zotero is its almost magical ability to create references and citations. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can create quick references, or you can use it as you're writing your paper. Let's create a quick reference list first. To do this, we'll need to have Zotero up and be in the folder that you need. Select the items you want. I am just going to select the first few articles here. Then you right-click and select Create Bibliography from Items. From here, you can select the citation style you need. These are the biggies. If you need additional citation styles, you'll click on Manage Styles and then go to Get Additional Styles. This will take you to Zotero's website, where they have almost 10,000 additional citation styles. I'm hopeful that you will be able to find the one you need there. I'm going to select APA, that's the one I usually use the most, and from there you have the option to select an output mode. I want bibliography. That is what your traditional reference list looks like. Citations are what you see in the body of the paper. We'll come back to that in a minute. The output method, I always select copy to clipboard just because this is the easiest and it works the best for me. Then you just click OK. Then just bring up wherever you want to paste your references. This could be a Word document, it could be a Google Doc, it could be a PowerPoint, an email, wherever you need to put these references. Then just hit Control V or copy, and voila. The one thing I have never ever been able to understand about Zotero is that when you're creating quick references, it always puts the references to the left of the margin. So I select it, and then you just fix the margins as needed. Now, this is really awesome, but don't get too excited. As much as I love Zotero, it always makes at least a couple mistakes. So it's a good idea to look through the reference list and identify any potential issues and make sure you fix them. So the quick references are great, especially when you just need something really fast, but Zotero can do so much more. By installing the word processing plugin, you can insert in-text citations and build your bibliography as you're writing your paper. In order for this to work, you just need to make sure that the word processing plugin is installed. To do this, you go to Edit and then Preferences. Scroll over to the Site tab and then select Word Processors. You will click on either install the Microsoft Word add-in or the LibreOffice add-in, depending on which one you have. You will know that the add-in has been successfully installed if you go back to Word or LibreOffice and you see this Zotero tab up at the top. In order to insert an in-text citation, click where you need the citation to be. In this case, I need a reference for this sentence, and I have one in mind. Then I go to the Zotero tab, and then I click on Add or Edit Citation. Once you select the Add or Edit Citation button, this little box will pop up. From here, you can search on author names, article titles, book title, journal title, anything that will help you find the reference you're looking for. I am actually better about remembering article names and author names, so I'm going to just type what I remember from the article title, which has to do with library anxiety. And the one I need is this bottom one. So once you do that, it's going to pop up looking like the in-text citation. From here, you can add additional citations, or if you're done, you just select Enter. And at your paper, inserting citations as you go. There is another way to it.
Yeah, so I'll just, I shared the link in view of time, so I just wanted to share something quickly as we wrap up. I did share a slide. It's just a premium package. So if you've noticed that this webinar was free, and of course it's not everything that will be free, and I'll be doing this once a month, different topics, different strategies, different lessons. But of course, if you want more on scientific writing, I'm offering this option for those of you who are on this call. Free slides, 2 free-hour sessions in person on virtual. And then of course this promo is valid up until end of September for only 600 kwacha or $20. So my email is there. feel free to reach out and then we can engage more on this platform. So guys, thank you very much and looking forward to the next webinar.
Thank you, Doc.